Most people believe they need to go out more, socialize more, and be more present so as not to lose themselves. They force themselves into commitments, dinners, and conversations that drain something they cannot name. And when they finally arrive home, they feel a void they interpret as loneliness. But Carl Jung understood something darker. What you call loneliness at home is not the absence of people. It is the unbearable presence of yourself after hours of pretending to be someone else. And the human body was not built to sustain this fracture indefinitely. You are not exhausted because of work. You are exhausted because you spent the entire day being someone you are not. Every calculated smile, every rehearsed response, every strategic silence leaves an invisible mark on the nervous system. And when the door closes behind you at home, it is not rest that arrives first, it is the bill. The bill for everything that was repressed to keep the social machine running. That is why so many people turn on the television the second they step into their apartment, check their phones before even taking off their shoes, and seek out any noise that might prevent an encounter with what was held back during the day. They are not afraid of the silence, they are afraid of what the silence brings to the surface. Staying home alone without stimulation, without an audience, without a role to fulfill, is one of the most uncomfortable experiences a modern human being can undergo. Not because the house is hostile, but because the house is the only place where the persona is of no use, and the persona, that mask you have perfected since childhood to be accepted, does not know how to exist without an audience. Jung was surgical in describing this. The persona is a necessary construction, but when it takes the place of identity, the return home becomes a confrontation. You enter the house expecting to rest and find a stranger staring back. That stranger is you, without the adornments that others demand. The first effect of staying home, then, is not peace. It is restlessness, and that restlessness is the price of admission. It is not a symptom that something is wrong. It is the sign that something has finally stopped being postponed. You begin to realize that the way you speak to your mother on the phone is not the way you speak to yourself, that the enthusiasm you show at work is only half the truth, that the patience you dedicate to your friends is an edited version of your real patience. None of this is a conscious lie. It is the persona operating on autopilot, protecting you from rejections that perhaps no longer exist. And staying home without a summons to perform begins to expose the weld points of that armor. This is where most people retreat. Most hear this restlessness and interpret it as a sign that they need to distract themselves, go out, meet someone, fill the space. And by doing so, they lose the only opportunity to gather the fragments of themselves that were distributed throughout the day among meetings, messages, and obligations. A person is absent from themselves for hours, and when they finally have the chance to return, they flee once again. That is why so many lives seem full on the outside and empty on the inside. It is not a void, it is an accumulation of parts of you that were never retrieved. When you accept staying home, however, something begins to change. Silence ceases to be a threat and becomes a chemical reagent. It reveals layers, and the first thing that emerges is not serenity. It is the shadow. Jung used this term to name everything you buried in order to be loved, accepted, promoted, chosen. Your swallowed anger when your boss shot down your idea, your muffled sadness when no one noticed your effort, your desire to disappear for a week, which you never admitted out loud, your hidden ambition because at some point you learned that a good girl doesn't want, a polite boy doesn't demand, decent people settle. All of this does not disappear because it was denied. Buried things do not die. They leak. They leak as resentment toward people who don't even remember what they did. They leak as exhaustion with no apparent cause. They leak as that sudden irritation with a stranger in the grocery store line, a disproportionate irritation that embarrasses even you. The silence of the house is the solvent that dissolves the lids of these jars, and that is why it is frightening. But Jung was clear. Encountering the shadow is not encountering a monster. It is encountering an exile. Those parts of you are not enemies. They are orphans. They were left behind in the name of an acceptance that often never even happened. You gave up your anger to be loved by someone who continued not to love you. You abandoned your desire to create, to fit into a position that continued not to recognize you. You silenced your boundaries to preserve a friendship that continued to ignore you. The shadow is not composed of the worst of you. It is composed of what was most alive in you, before you learned that living that way came at a high price. Staying home is, therefore, the only address where this reconciliation can happen, not because the house has some mystical power, but because it is the only place where no one is watching, and what no one is watching you do not need to disguise. And what you do not need to disguise you can finally hear. That is why I prepared the awakening code for you. If this restlessness about staying home is taking you apart from the inside, if you realize that running away from silence has become a habit and the return to yourself has become painful, this is not a sign that something is broken in you. It is a sign that individuation has knocked at the door and you keep pretending you didn't hear. The awakening code is an inner map based on the psychology of Carl Jung, with one lesson per day for 60 days. Each day brings a key, a question, and a declaration that force you to cross what you have been avoiding. Without drama, without a ready-made formula, just the real work of becoming who you are. The guide is in the first pinned comment. If this video is touching you where no one touched you today, write the word silence down below, not as applause, as a symbolic commitment that you have understood that the escape is over. After the shadow begins to be recognized, something more delicate emerges, something that a full schedule never allowed you to hear: intuition. And here, a contemporary illusion must be dismantled. Intuition is not a mystical gift reserved for a few. Intuition for Jung is a function of the psyche as concrete as logical thought, but it operates on a frequency that external noise cancels out. Intuition needs space. It needs boredom. It needs dead hours in which the mind has no task and can finally process what has been piling up. You did not lose your intuition out of incompetence. You buried it under notifications, playlists, series, footnote conversations, all tools that are legitimate in themselves, but lethal when used uninterruptedly as an escape. Notice this. Most of the wrong decisions you have made in life were not for lack of information. They were due to an excess of noise. You knew. Some part of you knew. You knew that person was no good for you. You knew that job was draining something essential. You knew that friendship had turned into a one-sided provision of emotional services. But the noise was so constant that the internal signal became a whisper, and the whisper became nothing. And then you call it a miscalculation. It was no miscalculation, it was sensory negligence. You silenced the only system that would have warned you. The silence of staying home restores this system. It gives it back slowly, without ceremony. It begins as a strange feeling when thinking about a certain person. It continues as an inexplicable hesitation before accepting an invitation. It matures as a sudden certainty about something that days before seemed complicated. This is not magic. It is the psyche finally managing to finish sentences that were left halfway through. Each hour alone at home is an hour in which your deep intelligence processes what the surface intelligence did not have time to digest. And the answers that emerge in those hours do not come with fanfare. They come as a quiet knowing, the kind you recognize before you are able to explain it. But there is a price, and it is honest to name it. When intuition returns to operation, it exposes truths that distraction had hidden. You begin to realize that certain conversations empty you out, that certain environments make you regress, that certain people you call close have never truly asked how you are, and there is no way to unsee this. An awakened intuition is a one-way street. It does not let you return to your former blindness, and that is precisely why so many people prefer to keep the volume high, because silence reveals, and what is revealed demands a response. While this happens, something parallel also reorganizes itself: your energy. And here is one of the most underestimated aspects of staying home. Continuous social life is not neutral from an energetic standpoint. Each interaction requires you to calibrate your tone of voice, facial expression, choice of words, memory of commitments, and management of others' expectations. Each of these micro-tasks consumes psychic fuel, and psychic fuel, contrary to what one might imagine, is not recovered with sleep. Sleep restores the body, silence restores the psyche, and they are different things. This is why there is a specific type of exhaustion that no amount of sleep can solve. You sleep for 8 hours, wake up, and still feel as though you have been run over. It is not a lack of bodily rest, it is a lack of withdrawal. Modern life extracts from you all day long, and you give and give and give until the only feeling left is that of being a vault looted from within. Staying home, with no obligation to respond, no productivity goal, no requirement to be available, is the oldest energy replenishment mechanism that exists. And we are not talking about becoming a hermit. We are talking about recognizing that the psyche has a budget, and that spending without making deposits is guaranteed bankruptcy. Notice how modern culture makes this almost impossible. Staying home has become synonymous with unproductivity, with sadness, with stagnation. If you decline 3 invitations in a row, someone asks if you're okay. If you admit that you spent the weekend alone and enjoyed it, something in the other person's gaze changes. There is a manufactured shame surrounding withdrawal, as if being with oneself were a problem to be solved. Jung would have said something simple and devastating about this. A culture that pathologizes silence is a culture that needs your absence to sustain itself. You are useful as long as you are distracted. You cease to be useful when you start to listen to yourself. And when energy is gathered, when intuition returns, when the shadow begins to be integrated, the most decisive process of adult psychic life enters the scene. What Jung called individuation. It is not just a pretty word for self-knowledge. It is not a synonym for self-improvement. Individuation is the movement in which a person stops being a mosaic of other people's expectations and begins to organize their existence from their own inner center. It is a brutal process because it requires demolishing structures that were built by people who loved you and did not know they were limiting you. Your parents, your teachers, your past loves, your mentors, they all deposited within you versions of what they thought was right, and a good part of those versions you absorbed without question. To individuate is to begin to question, not with adolescent rebellion, but with adult precision. Why did I choose this profession? Why do I tolerate this type of relationship? Why do I feel guilty when I rest? Why do I need the approval of people whose lives I do not envy? Why do I call it love when, in an honest light, it looks more like dependency? Each of these questions is a small death of a version of yourself, and each such death requires a space in which to occur. This space does not exist amidst the crowd. It only exists at home, alone, with enough time for the question not to be muffled by the next notification. Individuation is not comfortable, but it is irreversible. Once you begin to see yourself, you can no longer unsee yourself, and herein lies the difference between people who grow old only in age and people who mature. The former continue to repeat at 60 the patterns they built at 20, because they never stopped long enough to revise them. The latter, at some point, accepted the discomfort of staying home and let life internally reorganize itself, not because it became fashionable, but because there was no other way out. There is, however, a risk in this phase, the risk of romanticizing isolation, of turning withdrawal into an identity, of thinking that being alone is synonymous with being superior. Jung was rigorous about this. Individuation is not an invitation to hermetism. It does not end at home, it only begins there. And if it ends there, it has become an escape with a pretty name. The point of staying home is the return. To return to the world with another internal structure. To return to the same people with different eyes. To return to the same obligations with different criteria. To return, but not to return the same. And if you are reading this and feeling that this reorganization has already begun in you, but you do not know how to sustain the process, the guide is in the first pinned comment. O Código do Despertar exists, so you do not shipwreck halfway through, where most people give up. 60 days, lesson by lesson, to transform this restlessness into direction. The decision is quick. Either you continue distracting your own awakening, or you accept the map. Here it is necessary to deepen what it means to return, because many people understand staying home as an interval, a pause, a breath, before returning to the same. And that is not it. If you do the inner work for real, the same no longer exists. People will remain in the same place, the scenery will remain similar, but you will no longer be on the same axis. And this generates friction. A friction that Jung described with clinical precision. The individual who becomes who they are begins to bother those who still live under the collective pact, not because they attack them, but because their mere presence denounces the possibility of another life, and that is unbearable for those who chose not to choose. Prepare yourself then for an uncomfortable realization. When you return to social life after a true period of withdrawal, some relationships will not survive, and not because you have become arrogant or distant, but because those relationships were sustained by a version of you that no longer exists. They were built upon the persona you have abandoned, and an old persona cannot sustain a new relationship. It is as simple as that, and as painful as that. You will realize that certain friends only connected with you when you complained, that certain family members only felt close to you when you needed advice, that certain partners only felt secure when you felt insecure. And what you do when you notice this is the true test of individuation. The temptation will be to go back, to voluntarily regress to accommodate the other, to feign your old fragility to keep the peace. This Jung would classify as a betrayal of consciousness, and the price of that betrayal is exhaustion. Again, deeper, more chronic, more impossible to hide. Because now you know. And to pretend after knowing is the worst kind of lie one can tell oneself. This is why many people who begin this process and do not complete it develop a sadness that antidepressants cannot reach. It is not chemical depression, it is a depression of conscience. It is the soul protesting against returning to the cage it has already recognized as a cage. Therefore, staying home does not end at staying home. Staying home is the dissection room where you examine the life you are living and decide which parts will continue to exist. And what returns to the world after that is a version of you with different parameters of tolerance. You will continue to love, but you will love in a different way. You will continue to work, but you will work for different reasons. You will continue to relate to others, but you will demand reciprocity without guilt. Not because you have become cold, because you have stopped being convenient. And being inconvenient to others is often the first sign that you have finally become available to yourself. There is a specific dignity in those who have gone through this process. It is not a performed dignity, not a rehearsed posture. It is a stillness in the eyes, a way of listening without the rush to respond, an ease in saying no without elaborate justifications. This dignity cannot be taught in crash courses. It is the residue of hours, days, weeks inside your home, traversing what most people avoid their entire lives, and it is paid for only once. Once conquered, it accompanies the person in any environment, in any conversation, in any conflict. It is the firm inner center that Jung spoke of, the point of gravity that does not depend on external approval to remain standing. And here is the paradox that closes the circle. You started by staying home, thinking you were isolating yourself, and you finished by staying home, discovering that only there was it possible to truly connect with yourself first, and from there, with anyone else. Because real connection is not between masks, it is between centers, and as long as you do not have a center, everything you call connection is just the fitting together of masks, useful for a time, insufficient for a lifetime. Staying home gives you the center gives you the rest. If you have made it this far, something in you already knows that you will not be able to go back to living as you once did. And this is a realization of no return. You can close this video now and spend a few more months distracting this call with noise, with a schedule, with screens, with people who confirm who you are no longer. Or you can accept that the restlessness that brought you here is not going away. It only grows. And, at some point, it grows to a point where distraction stops working. Jung left no easy promises. He left a dry observation. That which is not brought to consciousness appears in our lives as fate, and fate, when not chosen, arrives in the form of a crisis. The choice, then, is not between working on your individuation or not. The choice is between crossing this threshold while you still have time, or being crossed by it when life decides for you. Staying at home is merely the discreet name we give to the place where this choice is no longer postponable. The illusion is over. Choose.